should see folks, I think, starting to trickle in here now that we've made it open. Go ahead and share that so folks know what which room they're getting into. Are you all seeing the full slide on your screen?
Yeah, now it's
Okay, thank you.
slide, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to confirm. Hey, Dana, thanks for coming.
I know that turned out well, Scott.
This where the photo's taken?
Yeah, it's
I
kind
think
of
Yeah,
it's a spot on the road where when you're riding your bike down, your mountain bike, you always stop there
yeah.
because the view is so spectacular.
I think this was the first day of field work we
Mhm.
did. Yeah,
And
I recall
it's
correctly.
also where during the Alisal fire, we had transitioned to the Type 3 team. And so we weren't staffing a night shift.
Mhm.
And everybody came off the line, and it was just me. I was the operations section chief, and the IC, the Forest Service Incident Commander. We were the only ones left anywhere near. And there was a report of a flare up, and I had to go drive up to that
Oh, geez.
spot and hike down into the burn. I became acutely aware of how aging I am now.
Yeah.
I stumbled my way through the black, trying to find this flare up all by myself with a shovel and a canteen of water.
Yeah.
To pour
Yeah.
on the spot. And it's hilarious.
I'm not in my 20s anymore. What am I doing?
No. And I found the flare up and had to,
Yeah.
brood on it for a while. It was a lot more than a canteen of water was going to put out.
When was this photo taken? It's even drier now, I think.
So this would have been March of 2021. If memory serves, if it's
Yeah.
the same day, I think that I believe that was it, March, middle of March.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago, yeah.
Yeah.
It was right before that Alisal fire. And so
Ah,
now if you're standing on that spot, you're kind of looking sort of along the perimeter of the fire, sort of the part of the eastern kind of perimeter of the fire.
I can't even look at your reports on live fuel moisture being a record and a new record and a new record.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty wild. I think at some point we have to recalibrate the curve.
Gotta know, we go critical earlier in the season every year, it seems like.
Yeah.
Off scale though.
Okay.
We'll probably get Scott.
Yeah, let's get going. I just want to confirm that we have folks that can hear us, because I don't see them in my panel list on the side. So
Either, yeah.
if somebody just gave a thumbs up, thank you, whoever that was. Appreciate that confirmation. So appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, let's why don't we get going? It's 6:04. Hopefully most people have trickled in by now. So I'm going to pivot this here. There we go. Okay.
Well, welcome everybody. This is the Gaviota Coast Community Wildfire Protection Plan. It's our second public workshop, and we appreciate everybody being here. We've got about 17 folks. We had 27 signed up, so I think we'll get going, and there may be a few more people coming in as well. And I think, Scott, you had a couple of little things about chat and putting the hand up, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple of comments on meeting logistics for those that haven't attended the Zoom webinar before. We have the raise hand function accessible. If you'd like to ask a question, we can unmute you at that point. And then if anybody's calling in from their phone and not viewing the screen, you can press *9 to raise your hand and we can unmute you that way. And then the Q&A box is also functional for typing questions in, and we will either address those live or in a response message back to you. So please feel free to reach out if there's any issues or if questions along the way.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Scott. And I'd like to, if we could, we'll start the meeting. Wanted to introduce the Honorable Joan Hartman, and she's the chair of the Board of Supervisors, and she's actually a board of director for the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council. She's been super involved in decision making and, matter of fact, grant funding, and she's just not only been there, as a leader, but she's done a lot of work. So we super appreciate all she's done. And Joan, yeah, if you had a few words.
Well, thank you, Scott. I represent the 3rd District, and 3rd District's been pretty radically redistricted, and I'm so glad that the Gaviota Coast is still in my district. As we all know, though, the Gaviota Coast is subject to really extremes in weather and especially sundowner winds. So fire is something that has always been an issue, but as the climate changes, it's even more important. It's the major risk in our area, and fire safety is, if it ever was, something, it cannot just be left to the fire department alone. There's now a concept of shared public safety, and that individuals and communities have to take part at the individual level, at the community level, to protect our property, our pets, our livestock, and human lives. And the best way to do that is really to plan ahead. So you think through all the eventualities. In looking at our county fire department, it's really interesting because they spend a lot of time planning, and they've got documents, and everybody's on the same page with these plans. So you're not, when the emergency happens, the plan is already there, and you just need to execute. There's no debate about what to do, just get it done. We could probably increase our safety if we lived in cinder block homes and scraped all the vegetation off the land. But we're really seeking an intelligent balance between safety and landscape values. And each community and each homeowner strikes this balance somewhat differently. But what's really great about community wildfire protection plans is it allows us to work together as a community to develop a plan. And so it's, there's been a lot of initial work on defensible space around homes, a new zone 0 from 0 to 5 feet around the house. But increasingly, especially after the Paradise Fire, community protection and buffers are really what's on the horizon. So I think that's part of what the draft plan is looking at. As you may know, insurance rules are changing, and homes and communities with more protections are going to get reduced rates or be able to get coverage where others can't. So there's a lot of incentives to doing this hard work, but I really commend everybody for really rolling up their sleeves and getting involved. With Dudek Team Scott and Scott, we really have the best, most experienced consultants in our area. And with County Fire and Rob Hazard, we really have some of the best historic and current mapping resources and on the ground knowledge. So I think this is going to be our most sophisticated community wildfire protection plan. And it's really the most distinctive because there's no area in our county like the Gaviota Coast. So again, thank you to everybody for being here, for participating, because it matters. This is an iconic area for our whole region. So it's really important that we do our best to get this right. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Well, we appreciate the shout out for that. And I think not just your leadership, but gosh, all the work that you've done, I think it really helps. So thank you so much. I want to do just another little shout out to a couple of people. One was, again, with the GAV plan way, back when, Supervisor Doreen Farr was the one that, put the in that plan, and that this community welfare protection plan would happen. And I remember, Joan, you were a planning commissioner back then. So kind of concurrent to that, we had the Gaviota Neighbors Group, where we worked actually several years as a steering committee to get it rolling, and we got the grant funding, so it worked out well. Additionally, just another shout out to Wendy Moda, Congressman Salud Carvajal's office. She's worked tirelessly. She was at a lot of our community meetings. A matter of fact, quite a few actually, at the Gaviota Neighbors Group, and was just really nice that she was just there lending her support as well. And I'm not sure, was Wendy on the call, Scott? I don't know if she wanted to say a few words. I don't know if we can find that out.
Dana, are you able to check for me?
Yeah, let me take a look.
Okay, we're going to confirm, Scott.
Okay, and then what we're going to do, we're going to introduce the team of speakers tonight, and then, but if she was on, I'd love to hear from her if she's on the call.
I'm not seeing Wendy on here, but Wendy, if you are, please, on a different or a call-in number, please go ahead and raise your hand. It doesn't look like we have her at the moment.
Okay, well, anyway, I wanted to be a shout out there because we've really appreciated. And again, it was Supervisor Carbajal back in the day, and now Congressman Salud Carbajal, and he's been just done a lot of work. He's where I was a fire chief down in Carpinteria. He just did a lot of work with us, so we really appreciate that as well. And if we could get the next slide, Scott. I'll just kind of briefly introduce the speakers today. Rob Hazard, Chief Hazard, he's a county fire marshal, is going to be doing a lot of the speaking tonight. He's an is the operations chief for our local Type 3 team, the fire team that goes out and fights fire. He's really one of the head tacticians, really for anything wildland. He's also on the Fire Scope Committee for Southern California, and they make the really tough decisions on when you have multiple fires in the South Coast and all of the southern part of California, making the hard decisions of who gets the resources. And in any case, he's done tireless work in Santa Barbara. He's helped with other community wildfire protection plans. He helped put together the Prisma Ridge grant funding, over $3 million. They're working right now on, he and Fred Tan put together a $6.4 million grant with Tepiscay, which was a community really in need of a lot. I mean, I was up there a couple times on fires, and they're charging really hard on that, which is a fantastic project. He also put together a $1.9 million Habivari grant, which is going to be coming up this year. We'll probably be chatting on that a little bit. Scott Eckert, Scott's a registered professional forester for 22 years, a certified arborist, and he's worked on other community wildfire protection plans for the Santa Barbara City. He's worked and helped Montecito Fire, and he's basically everything GIS for mapping. You're going to see that tonight. And he did work with CAL FIRE on fuels reduction and vegetation thinning projects and forest rehabilitation projects. And I'll have a few words over the course of this. Again, my name is Scott Kaufman. I'm a retired battalion chief with Carpinteria Fire. I was with them for 35 years in charge of prevention. And I did actually help set up a Firewise community at the Hollister Ranch. I have some property there. So we're charging hard on hopefully keeping the community safe there. So that's your team, and we'll get started.
All right. Rob, did you want to jump in here? You're muted. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Rob Hazard. This project is near and dear to my heart. Actually, my family moved up to the Refugio Pass area back in the 70s, and I was about 8 years old, and basically raised there my whole life until I was a young adult, and then moved on. But I still have a small cabin up there, and I still frequent the property. My father and brother and sister still live up on our family plot. And just randomly, I've been involved in all the fires that have occurred up there in the last few years. I just seem to always be on duty on the day that those fires hit. So I love the area, and it always seemed to me that we needed to do something in terms of cohesive planning. We'd worked on community wildfire protection plans previously. The county fire department had done one for San Marcos Pass. Montecito had done one for their fire district. The city had done one years before. Goleta City had a plan, but we didn't have anything out in Gaviota. And kudos to Scott Kaufman and a lot of the folks that were involved with the Gav plan, because that really was where they started talking about the need for a comprehensive fire protection plan. And so sometime around 2016, 2017 is when we began meeting, some informal meetings, talking about putting together a CWPP. We formed a steering committee in 2017. We would meet at El Capitan Canyon. We had some great breakfast meetings there around the fireplace, and really started to put together kind of the germ of the idea and who the key players were going to be. And then in 2019, that steering committee approached the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council with the idea that the council would support the CWPP and actually fund it through a grant. And it turned out to be probably one of the key elements that has contributed to the success of this project, because the Fire Safe Council, being non-governmental body, is very nimble, and they've proven that they have a pretty a good capacity to manage a project like this. And they also are, it's a very diverse group. The executive board is very diverse, and there's a lot of balance to the decision processes that come out of the Fire Safe Council. They applied for a grant through the CAL FIRE Fire Prevention Grant Program. They were awarded the grant, and that began the planning process. We reached out to several different fire protection consultant firms, and Dudek was selected as our consultant to essentially guide the project and create most of the product. In 2021, we started the development process. We did a ton of field assessments in the spring of 2021. And interestingly, this project coincided with a large wildfire that occurred right in the middle of the planned area. So that's kind of rare. Typically, wildfires occur on a fairly infrequent basis in any given place. And so the fact that you'd have a CWPP coming together right around the time that you have this large fire was just an amazing coincidence. We conducted, during those field visits, a lot of our hazard assessments. We conducted our first public meeting in September of 2021. And then October was when we had the Alisal fire. And the Alisal fire actually had quite a bit of impact on this development of this plan in terms of changing a few perceptions of what our fire risk was. And it also had quite a few lessons for where some of the vulnerabilities were. So in 2022, we continued the process. We maintained development team meetings throughout the spring of 2022, and the draft plan was released in July, which is now posted on the Fire Safe Council website. So the development team essentially was comprised of representatives from some of our local communities, representative from Santa Barbara County Fire, representative from the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council, some folks from state parks, from the Nature Conservancy. That was particularly important because, as you'll see later, the Nature Conservancy now has the single largest parcel of land within the plan area. We had representatives, again, from our smaller communities that comprise the larger plan area. So these would be like Hollister Ranch, Benedito Canyon, Farron Road community, the El Capitan Estates community, Arroyo Hondo Preserve, El Cap Canyon, Refugio. This development team really, for us, the importance of the development team was the local knowledge, the people that actually lived in the area, getting their feedback for what their concerns were and the values that were important to their communities. That was really the most important component that the development team brought in. Next slide. So we had a lot of agency representatives that we met with. And this would be not just this list here, but these were the main players that we had a lot of consults with: California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, otherwise known as CAL FIRE, California Department of Parks and Recreation, particularly important because the state parks have quite a bit of land holdings within the plan area, as we all know. Caltrans, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Santa Barbara County Executive Office, the Santa Barbara County Office of Emergency Management, our local planning department, the county planning department, county public works, Los Pardos National Forest, and the Vandenberg Air Force Base. Now, of course, the name being changed to the Space Force Base. Next slide. And just real quick, this slide just demonstrates some of the meetings that we had, our development team meetings, June, August, March, and May. We had a agency meeting on March 1st of 2022, and then a bunch of field assessment meetings. These were all-day field trips where we went off into different communities and focused on certain areas, gathering data and talking to a lot of the property owners. Next slide. One of the most important components of our plan is community input. This is our second public workshop. Our first was on September 28th of 2021. We again conducted numerous development team meetings. We also had a survey, and it's still up on the webpage, where people could go onto the Fire Safe Council website, go to the project webpage, and fill out a survey with a lot of questions regarding the types of concerns they had, the issues that were the most important to them, whatever those might be, the type of fire mitigation that they were supportive of. We have a comprehensive webpage developed for the project, which is hosted by the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council. Field meetings were probably one of the most important thing we did, which was getting out into the field, meeting with landowners, collecting data, and particularly after the Alisol fire, touring the fire area and gathering data on what the fire impacts were on infrastructure. And then meet a lot of emails and phone calls and meetings with development team reps. Next slide. So real quick, what is a community wildfire protection plan, otherwise known as a CWPP? It's a plan for at-risk communities. It's developed collaboratively. Primarily, it identifies and prioritizes areas for hazardous fuel reduction treatments and recommends best management practices to balance the needs of ecological preservation and protection with fire mitigation. And then finally, it recommends measures to reduce structural ignitability. In other words, making our infrastructure, homes and businesses and everything we build less susceptible to fire. Next slide. There's a couple things that a community wildfire protection plan is not, and this would be, it's not a decision document. So you're going to see a lot of recommendations come out of this plan, but that's all that they are. They are recommendations that guide future potential projects that would be considered decision documents. Those projects would have environmental review, they would have work plans and how to get the projects done, funding, and those would all involve some kind of agency or governmental decision process. A community wildfire protection plan is also not a vegetation management plan. And so I will tell you that for this plan area, the county fire department and the U.S. Forest Service maintain vegetation management plans. The plans are very specific to certain projects and to certain priorities that the fire agencies have. And in some cases, a CWPP is going to be looking at things in a different way. It's really a plan for the residents, the community, and it's not to be considered a plan for agencies. It actually helps to guide plans that agencies may put together or have. It's definitely not an environmental analysis document. Every action that is recommended in the CWPP will have to go through environmental review. And it's that process of looking at the potential impacts of a project that guides what type of environmental review document you create. And the CWPP is not a project by the state definition. It's not going to create any kind of change in the landscape. It's simply what I consider to be a blueprint document that says, hey, here are some things you could do to achieve these goals you've identified. And we will go through the goals of the project here shortly. So again, they're educational documents. They're not going to commit any agency or the public to a course of action. They're simply going to recommend steps we could take to mitigate fire risk out in this area. Okay, next slide.
Yeah.
There are some requirements, and these requirements go back to the founding of CWPPs, which was in 2003 as part of the federal Healthy Forest Restoration Act. They required that if communities wanted to put in for federal grants, they had to have a CWPP. And so, years later, we have many sources of funding for projects, way beyond the original Healthy Forest Restoration Act. These days, most of our funding comes from state grants, but CWPPs were recognized as important documents that could give granting entities, whether it's the federal government, the state government, or local governments, gives them assurance that a project was actually going to get done if it was in a CWPP. Because one of the most important things a CWPP does is it gets input from the public, from the residents, the communities, and those projects that are identified in that document, you're going to have assurance that they're supported by the community. So the minimum requirements of a CWPP, as outlined in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, was that you had to have regional collaboration, you have to develop prioritized hazardous field treatment units, and you have to develop strategies to reduce structural ignitability. The plan requires approval. It has to be approved by the local government, in this case, the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors, and by the local and state fire agencies. So it has to have the signature of the Santa Barbara County Fire Chief and the CAL FIRE Unit Chief, in this case, San Luis Ranger Unit. And the benefits of an approved plan: it helps to identify and clarify priorities for the protection of life, property, and critical resources. And it provides access to federal and state grant funds to accomplish wildfire hazard mitigation work. And we've seen that happen. So in all of our communities that have CWPPs, they have been successful in obtaining grant funds to get projects done. So for the Gaviota Coast, we've seen with the incredible fire history in the area that there is a definite need for mitigating wildfire risk. And this is going to be an important first step in moving forward with that type of activity. Next slide. So again, how can this plan help the Gaviota Coast community? We will better identify fire risk. We will expand wildfire risk reduction options. These could include vegetation and fuel reduction projects, could include structural hardening projects. It's going to give us access to grants. It involves a huge amount of stakeholder coordination. So already there's been numerous contacts and interactions between various stakeholder groups in developing the plan. And that creates relationships that will make projects streamlined and more efficient. Integration of fuel treatments with cooperators. So the plan area has two large fire agencies, Santa Barbara County Fire and Los Padres National Forest. And it's critical that these agencies are coordinated and that they're talking to each other and that they're aligning their goals and their objectives so that we have projects that minimize to the greatest extent possible any kind of adverse ecological impact and maximize the amount of fire mitigation. So it's very important that these agencies come together, and the CWPP allows that. And then developing best management practice for any type of vegetation management. So this is guiding principles for future projects based on the values in the community and what the community wants to see. In many cases, communities will become very involved with these best management practices because there'll be certain things that they don't want to see in their landscape and maybe other things that they will support. And so we work very hard in this plan to ensure that we're including fairly restrictive best management practices to ensure protection of the environment. Next slide. So our goals: reduce wildfire hazard within the plan area to enhance community and firefighter safety. We want to enhance protection of values at risk from wildfire, including our structures, the infrastructure, agricultural resources, recreational resources, and natural and cultural resources. We want to integrate fire and fuels management activities with land management priorities. We want to increase community awareness and education about practices to reduce wildfire risk, most importantly, including defensible space, fuels reduction, and structure hardening. We want to encourage communication and coordination of fire and fuels management activities with all the affected stakeholders. And with that, this is our map of the plan area. I'm going to turn it over to Scott Eckert from DUDEC, and he will guide us through all of the plan elements.
All right. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. Yeah, as Rob said, I'm going to just review a little bit about the plan area itself, a little bit about our hazard assessment, and then a summary of the plan findings and recommendations. So just for those not familiar, this is the plan area boundary. As you can see on the map here, the plan area encompasses 106,000 acres from Farron Road, the Farron Road community on the east, out to Point Conception and Halama Beach County Park and Vandenberg on the west. In terms of ownership, as Rob mentioned, the Nature Conservancy has a large piece of land there on the western portion of the plan area. Private land encompassing 52% of the plan area. Nature Conservancy with about 23%, and other large land holdings by the Forest Service, state parks, Santa Barbara County, and a few other public agencies. So one of the things we looked at in developing the CWPP was the wildland urban interface. And so this is the area that is adjacent to or proximate to the developed areas, community structures, things like that. So we looked at some publicly available data sets that just weren't comprehensive enough for the plan area. So we essentially created our own for this plan. And when you look at these structures throughout the plan area, you can see those there in the darker colors there at the center. When we look at the area within 100 feet of those structures is about a little over 1,000 acres of the plan area. And the area within 300 feet of those structures is about 3,400 acres. So you can see from this is also a good representation of the development pattern in the plan area, fairly scattered, not really what would be considered a classic wildland urban interface, more of a wildland urban intermix where you have native vegetation, intermixed between structures. Vegetation in the plan area is, primarily lumped into these, three main categories: grass, shrub, and woodland. Of note is the yellow color on the eastern side of the map there. That's chaparral vegetation at middle and upper elevations, and that transitions down into more grassland vegetation at lower elevations, and a little more of the sage scrub vegetation in the western part of the plan area, and the Hollister Ranch and the Nature Conservancy property. We looked at fire history as well. Between 1916 and 2021, 36 fires had burned in the plan area. These fires ranged in size from 9 acres to 79,000 acres. And then, of course, in recent years, as you can see on the map, we had the 2016 Sherpa fire, which burned about 7,400 acres. The 2017 Whittier fire, which burned a portion of the plan area, and in its entirety was over 18,000 acres. And then, of course, the 2021 Alisal fire, which burned almost entirely in the plan area at almost 17,000 acres. Of note, too, on this map are the small red triangles. Those are wildland fire ignition points mapped by Santa Barbara County Fire. We also analyzed the data that accompanied that mapping data, which is presented here in this table. So we looked at ignitions within 2 miles of the plan area between 2007 and 2020. There were 199 ignitions. The largest proportion of those that was not undetermined were vehicle fires at 25.1%. And if I'll toggle the map back, you can see the red triangles there on the map follow pretty closely Highway 101 and Highway 1. So that is one of the concerns that we identified in development of the plan, was the ignition potential along roadways. Of course, the Alisol fire happened during the middle of plan preparation. And as Rob mentioned earlier, we kind of took a step back at that point and looked at some of the issues that emerged and some of the community priorities and feedback after that fire.
Hey, Scott, can we go back first?
One slide right there.
Yeah, you're good. And I was just thinking, from a community perspective, we look at, what are causing all these ignitions. The electrical power poles, they were 23 ignitions at 11.6%. That's a problem. Vehicles along the roadway. So again, that tells us a lot, with Caltrans and with our own driveways. The idea of, that zone 3 where you get 10 foot of clearance on either side of your driveways, real important with 50 ignitions, 25%. Another one, of course, is arson. Being vigilant. Everybody keeping a sharp eye out with the 12 ignitions there. Equipment. The idea on that is, when we talk about when you have if you're doing, weed abatement, that kind of stuff in the mornings is a good time to do it, and watch any arc or spark, making sure you have, your fire extinguisher prepared or your water extinguisher kind of ready to go. One other thing which is kind of cool is that we've, with County Fire, with their help, we've got a pretty big blitz program to not have fireworks in the plan area, and we've only had 2 ignitions. So fireworks were kind of a success story, with only 2 and 1%. So those are some of the things I think that kind of tell us with the different projects we might be wanting to come up with, and some of what we want to do. These are the issues we have in the plan area and how we're going to mitigate them. So this is, I thought, kind of telling and worth chatting on for just a second.
And then I'll just add one last little point. We've looked at the undetermined causes over the last 10 years, and I think somewhere to the tune of 3/4 of those happened within 50 feet of a roadway. So we're pretty confident that most of those undetermined were started by vehicles. It's really hard when you get roadside ignitions. Typically, they're only a small fire, maybe an acre, and trying to find the cause. I mean, it's typically a tiny piece of catalytic converter, and it's very difficult to find. So the vehicle ignitions is probably a higher number than what you see. Just consider that.
Thanks, Rob. That's important clarification. So part of the development of the CWPP included some analysis of fire hazard in the plan area, and we did that a few different ways. We looked at mapping integrated hazard through the Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System tool. That is a U.S. Department of Interior product that we use that maps fire hazard, fire behavior, and fire probability. We looked at, we used Flam Map to look at the potential for spotting ember production from wildfires, and we looked at suppression difficulty data, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of these in subsequent slides here. Spotting probability, this was modeled looking at worst case sundown or wind conditions, fires occurring under those conditions. And what this is showing on the map here is the color gradient is showing the density of ember generating vegetation, and where it's producing spots or embers, I should say, that are being cast ahead of the fire front and can result in a expanding the wildfire perimeter. We see the highest concentration of those along the San Ynez Mountains ridge line there, a little bit within the plan area, but also just outside of it. But what we also see is that spotting is possible throughout most of the plan area, almost its entirety.
Maybe in there a little bit on that.
Sure.
That was so when you look at the east part of the district, and you got Jay Rusky and those guys over on Farron Road, we go, oh my gosh. So, the idea is we want to protect them, but all that basically tree spotting that's coming from there, is dramatic. But on the other end of the district, we don't have as many trees, but you do have, pretty large spotting potential, and some of that's, pretty long distance spotting as well. And I was wondering, could you go back 2 slides, Scott, just for a second to that Alisal fire one?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just give just a real quick shout out to, again, on this, when we look at the burn scar, they did, the United States Forest Service and CAL FIRE did a real thorough investigation of those. And we found, we still have some issues that are coming up with, again, those areas that were burned real heavily, cause potential for flooding. And the Arroyo Hondo Canyon, Arroyo Camada, and Refugio, are still not out of the woods completely, so we still want to be vigilant about that. And, that was in the plan. And again, those communities that are still at risk for future flooding and that, we want to keep looking at that. And again, for those of you in those communities, I mean, the work that they did on the bar report, and that was pretty good. And so it gives some pretty good maps, locally of those different communities and some of the things we're looking at, in the future. So kind of a shout out to them, and just wanted to note that it is in the plan.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. One of the other fire hazard analyses that we did was looking at integrated hazard, and so that's what we're looking at on this map. And this is a combination of fire intensity, which is represented by flame length, and fire likelihood, which is represented by burn probability. And so this combines those two. And so it looks at essentially relative hazard throughout the plan area. And interesting, what we see is that, it's about 60%, a little over 60% of the plan area is mapped as middle or greater hazard ranking. So you can see the distribution across the plan area with notable concentration of higher and highest hazard in the eastern part of the plan area. We took that data actually and did some GIS calculations on that based on the location of structures and their the immediate surrounding area. So nearly half of the land area within 100 and 300 feet of structures was ranked as a middle hazard or greater. So this was just kind of reinforced the importance of defensible space, creation and maintenance around structures. One of the other hazard variables we looked at was the age of vegetation, and this came after the Alisal fire. We started having that conversation about, the ignitability and the hazard of chaparral and sage scrub vegetation specifically. And while that vegetation will burn, once chaparral hits that 30-year mark approximately, and 15 years for sage scrub, the amount of retained dead material and in the vegetation itself just increases that fire intensity and has a direct effect on suppression capability. So we did an analysis on vegetation data, and what we're seeing on the map here in orange is the chaparral vegetation that's 30 years old and greater, and the kind of light red color is the sage scrub vegetation that's 15 years old and greater. And we again see sort of a concentration of that older chaparral in the eastern part of the plan area. And of course, you see the fire perimeters there that directly affected the age of vegetation, from the Alisal fire, Whittier fire, and Sherpa fire.
Yeah, on this one, Scott, I'd just like to say, all those years when I was a firefighter, that when you get the 15 to 30-year-old brush, you play hell trying to put that stuff out. It's because you have such a dead component. It just rips. And then those fires that have just happened, it's a little bit easier to go in and put those fires out. So matter of fact, Rob, I don't know if you want to come up and talk a little bit about it, but we start thinking about fire return interval, and again, good defensible space or prescribed burning. But those are important concepts. So I don't know if Rob, if you want to just maybe speak a little bit to fire return interval, might be important.
For sure. When we're seeing these large fires, previous burn scars or areas that burned within a short period of time end up becoming sort of strategic blocks to fire spread. And we saw that pretty dramatically with the Whittier fire and the Sherpa fire. Those two fires were a year apart. The Sherpa fire had burned a little bit to the west. The Whittier fire burned into it, into its eastern side, and overlapped by just in some cases a few feet. When we look at the Alisol fire, it burned through the Sherpa fire, but with much lower intensities. Essentially became kind of a ground fire that just sort of burned through the grasslands that was underneath the emerging chaparral. In many cases, barely burned the chaparral in the area that was within the 2016 Sherpa fire. And then we actually saw, believe it or not, the 2004 Gaviota fire, which is not on this map, but it's just west of the Alisol fire. The Alisol fire burned into that field bed and dramatically reduced its rate of spread and intensity. And that's that finger of fire that you can see on the west side of the Alisol that kind of burned across the coastal foothills. It really didn't progress with any great speed, and we were able to get hand crews in there and literally go direct on the fire's edge with hand crews. So it makes a big difference.
We do
Thanks,
have
Rob.
we do have a
Go ahead.
question in the Q&A, so if we can expand on that answer about fire return intervals a little bit. The question being that when we do have fires occurring repeatedly in the same area, what are the characteristics that lead to that?
Typically, when you get fires that are burning in the same spot, overlapping each other, it's burning through what we call light and flashy fuels. These would be like grass type fuels. These are this is the primary vegetation that kind of comes back very quickly. And typically, we would say a grass field type is fully mature after one season. So it's an annual vegetation. It grows, cures, and dies all within one growing season. So that's typically where we have fires that can overlap year after year after year, kind of almost creating a feedback where it sort of causes a type conversion into a grass field type, something to be avoided, quite frankly. And I think that's another important point of this slide, is that this concept of fire return interval, there is all of the vegetation in the plant area is adapted to fire. But the frequency of fire and the intensity and severity of fire have a big impact on how that vegetation rejuvenates. And chaparral is very resilient. It will bounce back after a stand replacing fire, a fire that literally burns it down to the dirt. The chaparral will rejuvenate. But if you put fire back onto that same plot too soon, say within a year to 5 years, it can heavily damage the chaparral, the newly emerging chaparral. Versus a grassland area, you can have fires year after year after year, and you probably really wouldn't tell the difference other than, the period of time that it's burned, because grass just grows every year, and it seems to be mostly unaffected by fire. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I would just add one clarifying point. The question noted the mapping showing overlapping fires, and some of that too is that you might have a fire that burned in the 60s, and then you have another fire that burned 30, 40 years later on top of that. So there is that length of time that allows in chaparral, for example, to mature.
Yeah.
So hopefully
that's a great question.
clarify.
So early in my wildland fire career, the maps looked pretty clean because we weren't really mapping fires prior to 1955. 55 was the Refugio fires, a pretty historic fire in Santa Barbara County, burned all of the Gaviota Coast. And then we had fires like the Coyote fire, the Romero fire, the Wellman fire. And they sort of covered our Santa Barbara County landscape kind of as a sort of a puzzle, but not a lot of overlap. Well, here we are in 2022, and if we try to put all of that onto one map, it's unbelievable. It's overlapping and it's overlapping again. And so we've actually found in our GIS section, we have to kind of do our fire history maps now by decade, because it just gets too crazy busy to even look at. And that's just the nature of our environment. It's fire adapted, and fire is a cyclical thing that will occur over time. So it's really the interval, the time between fires that's important. If you're looking at the landscape from the health of the vegetation, that fire return interval is very important.
Thanks, Rob. So back to some of the hazard data sets we looked at. So this one was another one we looked at, and this is a representation of suppression difficulty. So this looks at, it essentially ranks in map form areas of the plan, areas of, well, a larger portion of the United States, but specific to the plan area, areas that have a higher difficulty for suppression. And those areas would be areas with steep slopes, heavy fuels, more extreme fire behavior that's anticipated. And so this map shows areas of higher suppression difficulty in red, orange and red colors. And again, we see that associated with the eastern part of the plan area, largely associated with the chaparral fuel beds, but we do see that in other areas as well in the eastern part of the plan area. And as the slide here notes, this the different considerations, as I mentioned, fire behavior, terrain, and fuels, but also firefighter line production rates and accessibility from roads and trails.
Yeah, and this, I just thought kind of a little bit of a shout out to Scott for putting this together. This is pretty cool. We've never had this before. And again, the idea, some of these areas, just the accessibility, you got to be a billy goat, tough to get into them. But others, when you look at where areas where you've got difficulty putting fire out from the fire crews, as it aligns with some of our road systems, that's really good information. And that's nothing we had, back in the day when I was a fire chief 10 years ago. The other thing was all that spotting, the mapping on the spot fires, and that's a new one too. So again, a lot of this mapping and that we have, we didn't have a decade ago. We've got it now, and I think that's kudos to Scott, and the GIS folks from County Fire, and makes a lot of the stuff that we're doing more robust. It proofs what we're doing, and if we're putting in projects, those kind of things, or like we say, firewise communities, where are some areas that may be more risky, areas that maybe we want to protect our homes, and that these are important maps to our communities. So I just wanted to thank Rob and his GIS, and to Scott for the work that they did. And like I said, these maps did not exist 10 years ago. So good stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So sort of shifting out of the mapping and the hazard assessment, this slide really summarizes the key issues that were identified by the community. Some of this is coming out of the analysis we did. Some of this is coming out of conversations we had with the community and feedback we got. So just, kind of bulleted out here on the slide, ignition potential was identified as a key area along, plan area roadways, as well as some key kind of gathering parking spots where people tend to congregate and park. Another one of the key issues was limited communication capabilities, just the canyons and the landscape and the makeup of the plan area just naturally provides these constraints to cellular service and internet access in some locations. Post-fire erosion and debris flow risk. This was known, of course, as something that occurs in the Front Range, but was brought more to the forefront after the Alisal fire, and specifically to access and egress implications on Refugio Road and the community that, the folks that live out off that road. The effective grazing practices was also a key issue, where we had higher fuel loads in areas that had formerly been grazed, but where grazing was removed, and how that just changed both vegetation composition, but also fire behavior. And that was observed during the Alisal fire. Evacuation was another key issue. The road network, a lot of narrow winding roads, some with one way in, one way out. Fuel breaks were identified as an important community protection feature. More importantly, I think identified in the eastern part of the plan area. Defensible space, also a key issue. Both the creation and maintenance of that defensible space by the community. Access, this plan area was a little more unique, I think, than some CWPPs that might be looking at a city or a smaller community, the network of ranch access roads is actually a really important asset to the community, both for access to firefighters, but also important during potentially for use as evacuation corridors during fire events. There's also quite a bit of critical infrastructure in the plan area. You have communications systems. You have the materials recovery facility at Tahigas. You have power lines and energy, and of course the road network. And then the population, of course. The plan area again is fairly unique. You have residents and homeowners. You also have non-English speaking community members, those that are working and living in the plan area. And then you also have a bit of a we'll call it maybe a transient population, in that you have recreationists and tourists coming to the area for sometimes short periods of time, maybe a day, sometimes a week, to recreate at the plan area beaches or trails, and maybe aren't aware of the fire hazard of the area that they're in.
And I can jump in on that. If we go back to Scott, the two areas, when we look at this from the community viewpoint, the one is the communications. I know about 6, 7 last fires that I was on in the Gaviota area, basically the phone system was down, the internet was down. We basically had no way of really communicating except for with our communities, with just getting together with them and chatting with them. So a lot of times some of the different internet things that would be available to people around the fire area were good, but because they're down for those victims that are in the fire area, were not as helpful. So the one thing I've looked at is the radio ready that the County Office of Emergency Management has, and trying to move that. And I think 1610 on the AM radio is something I'm hoping we can expand on in the Gaviota areas, where people could go to that and be able to use it. The other thing was on the non-English speaking populations, and that we want to really more that we can do, again, with our Firewise communities and with the Fire Safe Council, being able to get to those communities. In particular, Ventura has an outstanding program for their non-English speaking communities, and we've modeled, I think, some of the different programs we want to do and get that out to those folks. And because the idea is, I think many of the people were getting all this good information, but other people just don't have any idea about wildfire. So the idea of getting to non-English speaking folks, communities at risk, and being able to get them. And again, there's a plan with the Fire Safe Council to be able to reach out to them. So in any case, we're looking at that. We've identified it, and we want to do more things. But I do think on that limited communications, that radio ready with the County Office of Emergency Management, I think that could be for all those ones where we just don't have any communications whatsoever. That might be about our last hope, along with signage and stuff that we're looking at too. But it's going to be a big one coming up.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So it looks like I have a couple questions, actually, if we want to pause maybe and address those, Dana.
Yeah, thanks. So we've got a question, a follow-up on what we were talking about earlier with the fire return intervals, whether grazing of recently burned areas is a good idea, or would that promote conversion to grassland? For instance, once vegetation is reestablishing, if it's still in the reestablishment phase.
The only thing I'd say to that is, I know, like, for example, just past history, after the 1955 Refugio fire, the entire Gaviota Coast was essentially grazed extensively from the coastline all the way to the top of the ridge. When I was a kid, I used to hike through the brush, and I'd find all the fence lines and old corrals that were literally buried under 20-foot chaparral. So I think that if your goal is to have the chaparral regenerate as healthy as possible, yes, you'd keep livestock out of it, although it's going to be grazed by natural, by deer and whatnot. Most, cattle, they are not going to eat the chaparral. So essentially it's just the damage that would be caused by them walking through it. But that's very different than fire occurring across that same landscape. And so we have a lot of evidence in Southern California of areas that have very frequent fire return interval and grass begins to intrude into the chaparral. And that's really what causes the damage, because the grass will carry the fire year after year. If there's no grass growing in the chaparral community, it won't support fire. It won't support fire for years. So we see that in the backcountry and areas where the Zaka fire burned. We haven't had ignitions back there for a very long time because the regenerating chaparral just wasn't able to support any kind of fire spread. And any large fires that burned into the Zaka fire scar literally went out within feet of hitting the Zaka burn scar. But yeah, that if your goal is complete preservation of the chaparral and you want it to come back as healthy as possible, you'd use some kind of fencing or something to keep livestock out of it.
Thanks, Rob. And then a follow-up to the suppression difficulty map, where we have rugged and steep terrain is where we're kind of seeing a lot of the suppression difficulty, higher difficulty areas. So can fuel breaks be put into these areas, or are they too steep and rugged?
They're for the most part too steep and rugged. The Forest Service, it's funny, that's a great question. The Forest Service actually came up with some plans to do field breaks on the Santa Barbara front country. They called them the lateral field breaks, and they came from the ridge top. There is a field break across the ridge top because the top of the San Ynez mountain range is relatively flat once you get up to the top of it. It's a broad ridge line, and they put in a very long, sort of infamous strategic field break. They type converted it with a lot of herbicide back in the day, things that we don't do anymore. And hence it being infamous. But it has been used now. My generation of firefighters have used those field breaks that a previous generation of firefighters put in. But the Forest Service had plans to do a lot more of these, kind of like a network that came off that main ridge line down all of the Santa Barbara front country, following all the ridges that went down to the ocean. And they didn't put a single one of them in. The only one they ever tried was the Windy Gap field break behind Santa Barbara, because that ridge line you can actually get a bulldozer down. But none of the other ones can you get mechanical equipment. And to try to use hand crews to put in a field break like that would be somewhat difficult. So yes, that's a great question. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have a huge network of field breaks in the Gaviota Coast, is because it's really rugged, and field breaks really don't make sense when they're not lined up with some kind of road access. That's the other thing. They've done studies on field breaks, and where a field break has a road system associated with it, whether it's a Jeep road or a paved road like Camino Cielo, it becomes much more effective as a strategic fire infrastructure. It's very difficult to use field breaks that have no road associated with them. You're putting hand crews out there. They have a bunch of work they have to do to prep those field breaks for a backfiring operation. And most fire crews are going to be reluctant to go marching down a field break in the middle of nowhere with no ability to get apparatus in there. So great question.
All right, and then one more question before we're caught up here, just if the presentation will be available.
Yes, yeah, we're posting all the presentations on the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council website.
Great, thank you.
And I think the last slide, we have a link to that site. So yes, it'll all be up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the CWPP also identified values at risk in the plan area. So those are summarized here on this slide. Of course, the population, structures, critical infrastructure. We talked a little bit about that. Ranching and agriculture was also an important and unique value to this plan area. Obviously, recreation with the National Forest and State Parks ownerships. And then, of course, the natural resources in the plan area, everything from, sensitive habitats to, slope stability and water quality. And so, one of the things that the CWPP does is make recommendations. Rob talked about this at the outset of the meeting. And so the plan has essentially section 6 of the plan is the action plan, the recommendation section. And there's recommendation category. There's 7 different categories of recommendations, as you've seen listed here, and we'll talk about a little bit more about each of these on the subsequent slides. So I won't go into too much detail here, but so the first category is vegetation management, and that was then broken out into, I believe it's 5 subcategories. So The first being agriculture and grazing. So there's recommendations for, continuing those activities for maintaining fuel loads, conducting, treatments along the edge of orchards for, protecting that asset, and then maintaining connectivity of these agricultural and grazing areas, to essentially provide buffers from the wildland areas and community areas. Defensible space, recommendations for, the county fire department to, increase compliance levels, identify areas for Firewise community designation. Scott mentioned this earlier, just a shout out to his efforts. The Hollister Ranch was the 500th identified Firewise community in the state, designated earlier this year. So well done. But recommendations to continue those efforts in other portions of the plan area. And then protecting, some of the historic and community structures in the plan area. Las Cruces School, for example, and some of the older structures at, Hollister Ranch, and other locations. Vegetation management, conducting treatments along roadsides. We had a discussion about, roadside ignitions and the importance of that, addressing and, removing invasive species in key locations, identifying temporary refuge areas or TRAs in key locations where evacuation may be difficult, maintaining some existing project areas that are currently being treated, and then targeted treatments for fuel load reduction and invasive species control. The next couple categories are fuel breaks, plan recommendations to. Sorry, Scott, were you?
Yeah. On those, Rob, maybe you might jump in on this a little bit. If you go back one, too many people are real familiar with the temporary refuge areas. So the idea of that, if you cannot evacuate, we do highly recommend people evacuate. But if you're trapped or whatever, if you have areas where you've got the fuels removed, you have like a safety zone that firefighters use, a safety zone or temporary refuge areas. And I think that probably a little bit of an explanation on that, Rob.
Yeah, it's essentially that you create an area that's survivable. And, it's a challenge because, what makes an area protected from wildland fire essentially is a combination of the topography of the area. And that's a fixed known quantity, right? If it's a flat area, it's a flat area. It's not going to change. If it's a ridge top, it's a ridge top. But the second component is the vegetation that covers it. Wildland fire is driven by three components: fire weather, topography, and the vegetation. That's what drives the behavior of wildland fire. And so if you're looking to create an area that's gonna minimize the heat impact, you're really looking at how you modify the vegetation so that you reduce the amount of heat impact. And then you have to look at, well, how many people are we talking about? So it could be a very large community and trying to put everybody into one area. So it's a real challenge, but it is something that agencies and communities are looking at because of the complexity and the challenge of evacuation. So evacuation is kind of like one of those buzzwords that everybody wants to throw out. The fire agencies are guilty of that more than anyone. We say, hey, ready, set, go. That's what we want you to do. But, it's tough to deal with some of our communities because just the road systems themselves aren't conducive to rapid evacuation. And honestly, many of our public roads, there's really not any long-term plans to make highways out of some of those mountain roads. That's just not going to happen. And so we've recognized that we might need a backup to the idea of evacuation. And again, this is something that this project, being driven by the Fire Safe Council, can make these types of recommendations in a way that, say, a county fire department can't, because our recommendation is you follow ready, set, go, which means you prepare and you leave early. But I can tell you that in the case of the Alisol fire, there were some folks up in Refugio that were stuck up at their homes and the road did not present a viable way to get out. So that's what the idea of a TRA is that maybe there are some areas that we could do some aggressive vegetation management every year. And that's the key. You have to do it every year. And typically you'd pick a natural area that's already safe, like a big meadow. And then you would just make sure that every year you graze the meadow or you mow it so that you can fit a bunch of cars in there and it would be a safe place.
Thanks, Rob. All right. There we go. Just moving along to the other categories of vegetation management recommendations: fuel breaks, maintaining Camino Cielo where it occurs in the plan area, connecting existing fuel breaks in the eastern portion of the plan area, maintaining strategic fuel breaks around critical infrastructure, connecting some of the north and south oriented fuel breaks, establishing a north-south fuel break near Hollister Ranch, and then ridgeline shaded fuel breaks on the Hollister Ranch and Nature Conservancy Dangermont Preserve properties. And then recommendations for prescribed fire to continue that practice and expand it where feasible, obviously in coordination with landowners. Some of the other categories for action plans included, recommendations rather, for action items were structural ignitability. So evaluating structural retrofit programs, conducting evaluations, community outreach and education, and pursuing grant funding for these types of projects. For community outreach and education, recommendations included looking into adding additional communities into the NFPA Firewise program, installing signage and awareness materials, for example, at some of the state parks or national forest trailheads and things like that. Conducting focused outreach to marginalized or vulnerable communities, and then conducting targeted outreach to the agricultural community. Recommendations for access and evacuation included, establishing or reestablishing or maintaining ranch road access across properties to facilitate both fire department access, but also evacuation in some key areas. Maintaining fire roads, limiting access or restricting access during certain, key high fire hazard weather, red flag warnings, for example, and then identifying potential areas for emergency access or fallback zones. Then finally, the last few categories include recommendations for funding. So pursuing grant opportunities. There's quite a number of grant opportunities identified in the plan. Investing in infrastructure and communications. So that might include data collection or alerting systems like remote automated weather systems or fire detection cameras, suppression equipment, enhancing or creating communications infrastructure to deal with some of the challenges that exist currently, and identifying and creating safety zones. And then post-fire recovery recommendations included those associated with evaluating alternative access, minimizing invasive species spread, and then developing post-fire rehab guidelines.
And I would just say that, and I know quite a few people on this call right now know that we do have some grants that are be coming up. So a lot of these different projects and different things we could be looking at. The Fire Safe Council has two particular grants coming up right now. We have a chipping grant for $2.2 million over the next 3.5 years coming up, and then we also have a $1.9 million herbivory grant for sheep and goat to get on some of the larger ranches, be able to reduce some of the fuels. So there, all that's there, and then the RWMP is another one, which is a real ambitious program that the Fire Safe Council has. So there's quite a bit of funding, and there's quite a bit of funding coming up, and we're also looking at potentially funding some other community wildfire protection plans in the county. So a lot of good things are going on. A lot of the money actually is here where it really wasn't 10 or 20 years ago. The monies are here now, and a lot of the stuff that we're looking at, we want to look at carefully, making sure it's environmentally protected, and we can go through this. So again, a lot of funding. And I would just say, from the Fire Safe Council viewpoint, gosh, we over 30 years, we had very, very small projects, not much going on. Right now, it's just exploding with the funding. So a lot of good things are going on. So my thought to the folks out there and the homeowners and that is stay tuned. And there's a lot going to be coming on. A lot of stuff, I think, to help these communities over really the next 5 years.
Thanks, Scott. And I think we got our last slide here. Just a reminder to folks, I got a quick update on schedule and just a reminder on the plan itself. So the draft CWPP, as we noted at the beginning, is out. It's available on the project webpage. The link is there, and I believe Dana posted that link in the chat, if I saw that correctly. Thank you. It's also, if you go to the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council webpage, it's on the resources tab at the top. The comment period is open through September 28th. We're having this meeting, of course, public meeting this evening. There will also be a development team public meeting on September 17th. That'll be in person. Location is to be determined. We will be updating the project webpage with the location when we have that nailed down. And then a follow-up to that meeting a few days later via Zoom. So if folks are unable to attend that in-person meeting, love to have you at the Zoom meeting. So again, please stay in touch via the project webpage for updates. Someone asked about the availability of this presentation. We'll have the slide deck and the video posted, and the draft CWPP is there for review. There's also a comment box at the bottom of that page to provide any feedback or comments. So
I just like to give a shout out here. On September 17th, we've got a public meeting, and actually we want to put the development team together. We've got the Gaviota Neighbors Group, all the folks out. There's a lot of folks from the agencies that are here right now. We're really kind of hoping to get a barbecue with everybody together on the 17th of September. And so the idea of, if you can make it on that Saturday, just love to see everybody get together. It's just been kind of a real hard work between all of us. So again, we just want to get a barbecue together and get everybody talking, maybe get a few comments in that. But the big thing is just, thanking everybody for all the good work they've done. But the other thought was, for those of you that can't make that date, Zoom meeting, probably 6 to 7:30 on September 20th. I think it's like a Tuesday following.
Tuesday, yeah.
If you can't make the in-person meeting, we've got a Zoom meeting, and we basically want to hear from everybody before then. And then, the following month, the working group, which is the county is going to get together to hopefully approve it, and then it goes before the Board of Supervisors. For a final vote. So it's we're getting toward the tail end now. And but I do say that we just had so many people that have opened up the ranches and that, and again, all the agency folks who've been, just a dream to work with you guys. So we want to put a little barbecue together to thank you. And like I say, get more input. So I wanted to put that out there. Rob, any other thoughts?
No, this has just been a great project, and appreciate the hard work from everyone. It's been a good experience working with everyone, and these can be tough projects, balancing a lot of different opinions and attitudes, and some people have concerns, and then other folks have concerns about the concerns. So this has been a refreshingly easy group to work with out on the Gaviota Coast. And it's a great place to go out and do our site visits and our field trips. It's gorgeous out there. So loved every minute of it. And there's some questions that I saw come up, and I could talk through a few of those real quick. So I see Jeff Farmer asked a question about a article, and I think it's probably talking about the Forest Service has a proposed project that they just posted. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of meetings and a lot of public discourse about this proposed project. It's very large. I saw it for the first time a few weeks ago. I think one thing most folks have to understand about some of the big projects that the Los Padres has proposed over the years, when it actually finally gets down to what actually gets done on the ground, It's not a whole lot. They don't have a big workforce anymore. So they spend most of their time in fire suppression. So the actual folks that do the work, the people that pull the trigger on the chainsaw, they're mostly spending their time in fire suppression. And so I think what the Forest Service is trying to deal with wildland fire mitigation, just like everybody. We are having unprecedented large fires that are having a massive impact on a lot of our communities. I will tell you from the firefighter standpoint, the impact of these large fires on my agency and the people that work for my agency, my fellow brother and sister firefighters, the impact has been significant. Much more than they thought when they signed up for the job. It's just essentially become all-consuming work. They get almost no break all summer long, and even now into the winter. And so just from the human toll on the wildland firefighting community, I think trying to create more preventative mitigation efforts would help that out, because I don't really think it's fair to just put everything on the back of the fire suppression community and not focus on some preventative actions to minimize that impact. And then the impact on the communities themselves. I mean, look at the town of Paradise that burned down, due to the campfire back in 2019. So we don't want that to happen in Santa Barbara. And we've had some structural loss, and we've had some loss of life, but nothing like we've seen in counties to the north of us and counties to the south. And our last historic major loss of infrastructure was the Painted Cave fire in 1990. I was there, a young hotshot, and right in the thick of it. And I don't ever really want to see that again in our county. I don't want to see 600 homes all burning at the same time with people running down the street, in a panic. And so I think doing this type of mitigation work is super important. I encourage the public to get involved with the Forest Service project. They need to hear from the local stakeholders. My agency, we're lucky because we're nimble. We're a small fire department, and in relation to how big the Forest Service is, the Fire State Council is a small group, and so we're very approachable. The community interacts with us on a constant basis, and so we can develop these plans like this plan that are very fine-tuned to the values of the community. And I think that's something that the public's going to have to work with the Forest Service to make sure that their plan represents the values of Santa Barbara County. Because remember, the Los Padres National Forest encompasses quite a few counties and many communities, and their guidance comes from the federal level. So you just have to spend a lot of time working with them. I think what we don't want to see is a huge confrontation that results in inaction from the Forest Service partners. There is a need for wildfire mitigation effort on the Los Padres National Forest. We just have to make sure it's appropriate. Second question. This is from Scott.
If I can jump in there just for a second,
Yeah.
Maybe from more of a homeowner point of view, when you look at that plan, I was pretty amazed that, to me, it looked like they had just a mountain of different areas they could have potential projects. So it really, from my viewpoint, it looked more like a wish list. It looked like there was just a huge area. Whether a part of that gets done or not, remains to be seen. And again, I think with this plan, what we've done is we've gone out there, walked the land. It's not a GIS exercise only. We're out there walking the land with the homeowners.
Yeah.
And we're talking about projects that we're looking at more shovel ready, where I think what the Forest Service is at their point right now, at the very beginning of it, is a wish list. I mean, again, I don't know that Rob could say that, but I will. It's a bunch of different projects, and some of them, that might be proofed out, others will not, but it's at the very beginning stage where this is at kind of the final end stage. So just as a homeowner, just kind of understand the difference. Theirs is more of a wish list, ours is shovel ready.
And just to give some members in the audience just a little assurance. So I am going to be meeting with one of the project, with one of the Forest Service individuals that's assigned to that project, myself and Nick Elmquist, who's a wildland specialist for Montecito Fire. We're going to meet with the local forest folks and just to sit down with them and, in a big way, pull out all of our CWPPs just so that they know, like, hey, we've done a lot of this planning work. And so these were the priorities identified for these local communities. And maybe that will hopefully guide maybe some of their future direction. They could take a look at what we, all the time and effort we put into these plans. They're typically 2 years of planning. So that might change some of what you see on the map once they look at our CWPPs. It probably change a little bit of their priorities. And then the second question was from Scott Cooper, and it talked about, if too frequent fire leads to type conversion, how do you ensure that prescribed fire doesn't contribute to type conversion? And should you only use prescribed fire in grasslands? So there's 2 different types of prescribed fires that happen in our county. One is where the fire agencies come in and use prescribed fire to return an area to a normal, what we consider, normal fire return interval, like a healthy fire return interval. Now, jury's out on what that is. Okay, so we know that Native American folks for thousands of years were using fire on a very frequent basis. There's plenty of evidence in Santa Barbara County of relatively frequent fire return intervals, somewhere on the tune of 10 to 15 years that they were burning along the Santa Barbara South Coast and into the backcountry. Then all of that stopped when Western civilization came into California, both from Mexico and then across from the New England states. And essentially laws were passed that outlawed open burning. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that we started engaging back in that. And that was through what we call range improvement associations. And these were essentially associations of ranching interests that were using prescribed fire to increase grasslands, because essentially grasslands is their farming product. They raise cattle, the cattle eat grass. And so the more grass you have on your ranch, you're going to have more product, agricultural product. We still have those associations in our county, and they still conduct those types of burns on their agricultural parcels. And these are called range improvement burns. The second type of prescribed fire, again, is what the agencies do to bring fire return interval into what we kind of consider an ideal fire return interval, where it's healthy for the chaparral, but it limits to some extent the buildup of dead, dying vegetation. And so essentially we would not do prescribed fire at a frequent interval that would result in type conversion. That would be outside of our prescription. The reason we call it prescribed fire is it has a prescription. It has a prescription for how often you do it, where you do it, and under what weather conditions to create a certain amount of fire intensity for a certain fire effect on the landscape. And so we would just simply not burn in areas that had burned within the last 20 to 30 years. We wouldn't plan a prescribed fire for that scenario. And we probably wouldn't even be able to get the fire to carry through that landscape. Again, typically, the reason that these fires carry through previous burn scars is wind-driven fire. And we don't do prescribed fire during wind-driven events. We don't do prescribed fire during a sundowner. So it's in my mind, that's a situation that's just not going to occur if your fire management is being responsible. And that's the salient issue with that question. As a community, make sure your fire management, in other words, your fire agencies, whether it's the Los Padres National Forest or Santa Barbara County Fire or CAL FIRE, is make sure they're being responsible. And that's part of what these documents are. A CWPP provides guidance. And one of the things that this document is saying is, hey, there may be areas where you can engage in prescribed fire, but it needs to be within a certain fire return interval. And the second question was, in our local canyons, creeks, and their riparian zones appear to be barriers to fire spread because they're wetter and have higher moisture levels in plants than upland areas. As a consequence, shouldn't we be protecting riparian zones from management such as livestock grazing, because they can help hinder fire spread?
We just got a minute or two, Rob, minute or two.
Yep. So yeah, that's a great question. We do see that riparian areas can provide quite a bit of positive benefit, particularly when they're hydrated, when they're wet. During drought years, we see these riparian areas burn fairly aggressively. So I would agree, yes, ensuring the health of our riparian areas can have a positive impact on wildfire mitigation for sure. And the last question is, the hillsides are denuded from the Circle Bar Beat up to Refugio Road for about 2 miles. Massive amount of rocks are exposed now to the effect of rainfall. There are many large rocks no longer having brush and trees holding up a 1-inch rain. So yeah, so this question is related to the potential for rockfall and debris flow within the Alisal fire burn scar, particularly on Refugio Road. And yes, it is a significant risk right now. And I would say if we look at the experience of the Montecito area after the Thomas fire, it was about 5 to 6 years that we were standing up our fire teams during rain events, literally bringing extra crews on duty to just drive out to the area where the rainstorms were going to happen and just be available all night long in case there was emergencies. Same with the road construction crews, bringing them all on duty, the public works folks just on standby. So it is going to be a constant problem in the Refugio area, something for the residents that live above Circle Bar B to be extremely aware when those rainstorms are coming and to plan ahead, whether they're going to shelter in place in their homes or leave before the rainstorm occurs. But the switchback area of Refugio Road is it's already a super narrow, relatively unmaintained road. And now with the lack of vegetation, it's risky to drive down it on a good day. During a rainstorm with rocks coming down, I would stay in my house or I would leave the day before the rainstorm. And I believe the county so the question finally ends with, is the county planning to perform any road work? And I've had discussions with the county road guys and they do have some plans to do some work in there. But those are good concerns that you can direct to Public Works and just let them know what your concerns are. And, if they get enough, if there's enough concern raised, they'll send up crews to figure out what mitigations they need to do.
Great. Well, thanks, Rob. And matter of fact, if we could, maybe Joan, if you wanted to close our meeting out with some of your thoughts on how it went, or maybe some things we can be doing. The big thing I would just say, Joan, before that is just for everybody to get a hold of the plan, especially that section 6, and read it over and give us more input. But Joan, yeah, any concluding remarks?
Well, I think we've all been presented with a wealth of information, and I've been through a couple of community wildfire protection plan, observing and approving them through the board. And I agree with Rob that this one has gone relatively smoothly, and really appreciate everybody who's rolled up their shirt sleeves and gotten involved, because I think Rob put his finger on it. There's a lot of community knowledge. And so this is the place to get the professional and community knowledge all integrated and come up with this host of projects and set the priorities and then start following through. So I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone who's participated. So thank you all, Scott, and Rob in particular, for all the work that you've done presenting this.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is just please provide comment to the document. So we have it available on the website, and we're encouraging folks to read through it. They're a long read. It's probably a couple hundred pages, I think, and it takes a while, but it's for the benefit of the community, and the more input we get from the community, and because we might have missed something, or maybe we're emphasizing something that the community doesn't want. So we really need to hear from you about your priorities and any suggestions for changes to the draft document.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
With that, are we adjourned?
I think we're adjourned.
So I don't-
We're
I don't
adjourned.
see any more questions.
Have a good
so
evening.
thank you, everyone. We really
Thanks,
appreciate your
everybody.
time.
Thanks, everyone.